Chapter 5. The First Word. Ethan's train back to Brooklyn crawled through a shroud of fog, the landscape beyond the windows blurring into gray nothingness. His laptop bag rested heavily on his lap, the weight of Maslow's manuscript, or rather his digital copy of it, a physical presence against his thigh that seemed to pulse with each mile that took him further from the estate. He hadn't planned to leave early, but after the nosebleed in the library, after seeing those words appear on his screen that he hadn't typed, he'd called Harold with shaking hands. "Need to head back to the city for a few days," he'd said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Personal matter. I'll be back to finish the cataloging." Harold hadn't questioned him, hadn't commented on Ethan's bloodshot eyes or the dried blood still crusted at the edge of his nostril. He'd simply nodded as if he'd been expecting this call. "House gets to some people," was all he'd said on the long drive to the station, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Now, as the train rocked beneath him, Ethan stared out at the fog and tried to convince himself he'd imagined it all. The manuscript writing itself, the perfect parallels to his own life, the blood. Lack of sleep and the isolation of the estate had played tricks on his mind. That was all. Yet his eyes kept drifting to his laptop bag, drawn to it like a tongue to a broken tooth. Beneath the nylon fabric, he could almost feel the manuscript's heat, a feverish warmth that didn't belong to any electronic device. When he shifted the bag on his lap, he could have sworn he heard a whisper, the dry sound of pages turning themselves. Theft has a price, something seemed to murmur just below the threshold of hearing. Words have weight. Ink remembers the hand that spilled it. The familiar confines of his Brooklyn apartment should have been comforting. Instead, the cramped space felt alien, as if in his brief absence the dimensions had shifted slightly. Walls stood just inches from where he remembered, doorways narrowed imperceptibly, ceilings lowered just enough to create a constant pressure at the back of his neck. The radiator clanked and hissed in the corner, belching tepid heat that carried a metallic tang, like hot blood on a frozen tongue. A fresh stack of mail crowded his coffee table, mostly bills with their urgent red stamps forming a pattern that, from certain angles, resembled a circle of desperate mouths. Ethan dropped his bag on the couch and went straight to the kitchen cabinet, where he kept a bottle of rye whiskey. He poured 3 fingers, drank it down in 2 burning swallows, then poured another. The liquor tasted wrong somehow, thicker, almost oily on his tongue. "Get it together," he muttered, running a hand through his unwashed hair. His reflection in the kitchen window looked sunken, hollow around the eyes, a stranger wearing his features like an ill-fitting mask. His phone buzzed. Clara. He let it go to voicemail, unable to face her questions about his sudden return. What would he say? That he'd stolen a dead man's manuscript? That the pages seemed to breathe when he wasn't looking? That he'd watched words appear on his screen, written by invisible hands? The whiskey worked its numbing magic as he moved around the apartment, turning on lights against the gathering dusk. Each switch flicked, each bulb illuminated, seemed a small victory against the darkness that had followed him from Maslow's estate. Yet shadows persisted in corners, gathered beneath furniture, pooled in the hallway outside his bathroom, deeper than they should be, more solid than absence of light alone could explain. When he finally worked up the courage, Ethan retrieved his laptop from his bag. The device seemed heavier than before, dense with forbidden knowledge. He set it on his desk, positioned precisely in the center, and stared at it for a long moment before opening it. His hands trembled slightly, less from fear than from a perverse anticipation, the same quiver that accompanied opening presents as a child, never knowing if delight or disappointment awaited. The document was exactly as he'd left it, 152 pages of transcribed brilliance. But the line that had appeared unbidden, the line about the thief returning to the scene of his crime, was gone. In its place, the paragraph ended normally, just as Maslow had written it in the original. "I knew it," Ethan whispered, a wave of relief washing over him. He'd hallucinated the whole thing, conjured it from his guilty conscience. Yet beneath that relief lurked something else, disappointment. Some part of him had wanted it to be real, had craved confirmation that he'd tapped into something beyond normal experience. The banality of a normal document felt like rejection. Emboldened, he scrolled through the document, admiring the prose. Even with his small edits, the text maintained its hypnotic rhythm, its uncanny ability to worm into the reader's mind. Each sentence seemed crafted to bypass conscious thought, to plant itself directly in the subconscious where it could take root and flower into obsession. This was more than a novel. It was a literary miracle that had somehow fallen into his lap. And now it was his. Twin impulses warred within him as his finger hovered over the touchpad, the urge to delete everything, to sever his connection to Maslow's work before it embedded itself any deeper in his psyche, versus the desperate need to share it, to gain validation for his theft. The latter won easily, ambition strangling conscience with barely a struggle. Before he could second-guess himself, Ethan opened his email and composed a message to Clara. "I've been working on something new, something different. I think this is it, Clara, the one we've been waiting for. First 3 chapters attached. Let me know what you think." His finger hovered over the send button. What he was about to do couldn't be undone. Once Clara read those pages, once she showed them to publishers, there would be no turning back. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead, his armpits, the small of his back. For a moment, he thought he heard Maslow's voice again, this time from the kitchen. A dry whisper that might have been the radiator, but sounded uncomfortably like, "Do it. Seal your fate." Ethan thought of his bank account, nearly empty, of his career, stalled and sputtering, of the promise he'd shown with his first novel, now just a distant memory in a rapidly evolving literary landscape, of the mounting bills, the looming eviction, the slow death of irrelevance. He pressed send. The relief was immediate and crushing. A weight lifted from his shoulders, only to be replaced by a different one, anticipation mixed with dread. He closed his laptop and returned to the whiskey bottle, seeking chemical absolution. As he poured his third drink, he noticed something strange, a dark residue inside the glass, as if the whiskey had left a stain that hadn't been there before. When he ran his finger around the rim, it came away smudged with what looked like printer's ink. That night, curled in his own bed for the first time in days, Ethan dreamed of Victor Maslow. In the dream, he sat across from the dead author in the estate library. Outside the tall windows, a murder of crows circled endlessly against a bruise-colored sky. The shelves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs, the leather-bound volumes pulsing in sympathy. Maslow's face remained in shadow, but his hands were clearly visible on the mahogany desk, elegant, long-fingered, stained with ink that glistened wetly in the lamplight. "You started something," Maslow said, his voice like pages rubbing together, words emerging in perfect cadence as if he were reciting poetry. "Now you have to finish it. The pen, once lifted, must complete its arc. The sentence, once begun, demands its period." "I will," Ethan replied in the dream. "I'll publish your book." "Not my book anymore." Maslow's shadowed face seemed to smile, teeth gleaming white in the darkness like pages yet to be written upon. "It's yours now, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, till death completes the narrative." As Maslow spoke, ink began to drip from his fingertips, pooling on the desk between them. The puddle expanded, impossibly large, until it became a black mirror reflecting Ethan's face, but older, haggard, eyes empty and mouth stretched in a silent scream. Ethan woke with a gasp. Sheets tangled around him and soaked with sweat despite the chill in the apartment. The digital clock on his nightstand read 3:17 a.m., the hour of night terrors and deathbed confessions, his mother used to say. Something wasn't right. The air felt charged, as if an electrical storm was brewing inside his bedroom. The hair on his arms stood on end, his skin prickling with static electricity. Even the darkness seemed different, thicker, more viscous, like ink diluted in water. Ethan sat up, eyes adjusting to the darkness. There, on his desk across the room, a small red light blinked. His heart lurched. His laptop was open, powered on, though he'd closed it before going to bed. Moving as if underwater, each step requiring conscious effort against an invisible current, Ethan got up and approached the desk. The screen cast a pale blue glow over his cluttered workspace, illuminating scattered papers and coffee cups. As he drew closer, he could see that a document was open, his transcription of Maslow's manuscript. But the cursor was moving. Words appeared on the screen, one after another, typing themselves with mechanical precision. Each letter emerged with a faint click that sounded nothing like his laptop's keyboard, more like an antique typewriter, metal hammers striking paper with physical force. Ethan watched, paralyzed, as a new paragraph formed before his eyes. The first word is a contract. The last word is a death sentence. Every word between binds author to text, blood to ink, until the story demands its final sacrifice. What begins with theft ends with tribute, paid in full, with interest compounded in crimson. A pen on his desk, a Mont Blanc he never used, a gift from Clara when he signed the contract for his first novel, rolled suddenly toward his hand. The movement was deliberate, purposeful, like an animal stalking prey. When he instinctively caught it, the nib pricked his palm. A perfect bead of blood welled up, black in the screen's blue light. "Jesus!" Ethan gasped, dropping the pen as if it had burned him. For a wild moment, he considered calling someone, Allie maybe, though they hadn't spoken since the breakup. Or his old college roommate, who'd once been interested in occult literature. Someone, anyone who might believe what was happening. But what would he say? "Hey, I stole a dead author's manuscript, and now it's writing itself on my computer?" They'd think he was having a psychotic break. Hell, maybe he was. The blood smeared on his palm, forming what looked like a letter, the first letter of his name, or perhaps of Maslow's. Then the laptop screen flickered and went dark, plunging the room back into shadows. In the sudden silence, he could hear his own heartbeat, too fast and too loud, and beneath it, almost subliminal, the sound of pages turning. Ethan fumbled for the lamp, fingers trembling. When light flooded the room, he looked down at his palm. The blood was gone. The pen lay on the floor where he'd dropped it, a plain ballpoint, not the Mont Blanc at all. "I'm losing my mind," he whispered, but even as he spoke, he noticed a pattern in the scattered papers on his desk. They had arranged themselves in a perfect circle while he wasn't looking. Sleep was impossible after that. Ethan spent the remainder of the night in his living room, lights blazing, the TV tuned to an infomercial with the sound muted. He didn't look at his laptop again, though twice he heard the distinctive sound of keys clicking from his bedroom, followed by what might have been laughter, or perhaps just the pipes complaining in the walls. Morning arrived, gray and sullen. Rain tapped against the windows as Ethan made coffee with shaking hands. The liquid brewed darker than usual, almost opaque, and left strange residue on the inside of his mug, residue that, if he squinted, resembled tiny letters. The events of the night felt distant now, dreamlike. Maybe that's all they had been, an extension of his nightmare. Stress and guilt working on his subconscious. His phone chimed with an incoming email. Clara, responding to the chapters he'd sent. The sound was ordinary, every day, yet it hit Ethan with physical force, a blow to the sternum that left him momentarily breathless. With trembling fingers, he opened the message. "Ethan, my God, I don't have words. Where the hell did this come from? This isn't like anything you've written before. It's brilliant. It's terrifying. Call me. Now. We need to get this to publishers immediately. This is going to be huge." Ethan stared at the message, a complicated mixture of emotions washing over him. Pride, vindication, and beneath it all, a cold, slithering dread that coiled in his stomach like a hibernating snake beginning to stir with the first warmth of spring. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Clara. "Seriously, Ethan, I've already sent it to 3 editors who are clamoring for more. One is talking 6 figures sight unseen. 6 figures. Call me before I have a heart attack. 6 figures." The number blazed in Ethan's mind, obliterating doubt, silencing the whispers of conscience. With that kind of advance, he could clear his debts, secure his apartment, buy time to write, to really write his own words this time. Perhaps this theft was justified if it gave him the freedom to create honestly in the future. Perhaps the end justified the means. As these rationalizations flickered through his mind, his gaze shifted to his laptop, still on the desk where he'd abandoned it in the night. A single drop of red had materialized on the lid while he wasn't looking. As he watched, it traced a slow path down the aluminum surface, leaving a crimson trail in its wake. It reached the edge and hung there, swelling, defying gravity for a long moment before falling to the desk below. Not ink, blood. His nose was bleeding again. The warm copper taste filled his mouth as more drops fell, each landing with a soft pat on the wood. They formed letters, then words. This is just the beginning. Ethan rushed to the bathroom, grabbing tissues to stem the flow. As he leaned over the sink, he noticed something strange on his hands. Despite having washed them thoroughly that morning, thin dark crescents had formed beneath his fingernails. Not dirt, but what looked like ink that had somehow seeped under the nail beds. He scrubbed frantically with soap and a nail brush until his fingertips were raw, but the stains remained, as if the ink had become part of him, embedded in his flesh like a slow-spreading infection.